Welcome to the Filmmaker Mixer podcast, the podcast by filmmakers for filmmakers. My name is Andrew, and I'm joined alongside my co-host Jeff, as always. Jeff and I are writers and directors and passionate about the art of storytelling. Filmmaker Mixer is a creative hub where aspiring and established filmmakers come together to share experiences, insights, strategies, and inspiration. Today, we are chatting with music industry veteran Richard Stumpf.
Hello, everybody. This is the Filmmaker Mixer podcast, and today we are chatting with Richard Stumpf. Richard is a music industry veteran, and he recently launched Hawkeye Music Publishing. Hawkeye Music Publishing signs active songwriters and artists and connects teams looking to sell music catalogs with their strategic partner, Roundhill Music. Richard, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me, Jeff. Appreciate it.
No, our producer, Melody, speaks very highly of you, so we're excited to have you on the show. You guys go back, I understand.
We go back to, I think, through middle school days. Yeah.
Wow, that's crazy.
Yep, it is. It really is. So it's good to reconnect.
And you're New York based, you said.
Yes, indeed. I'm in Westchester County. Offices, well, up until recently, offices mostly in Manhattan. Although after the pandemic, like a lot of people, we've rethought where we actually and if we actually need what we can consider a proper office.
It's funny how that's changed.
It is, and to be honest, like what I do now is really, 99% of it is creative. I've outsourced the back office of the publishing company to another administrator. So it's more important that myself and our people are in studios with creators and taking those types of meetings, which I find is just as easy to do at, say, like the Soho House in Manhattan versus like renting an office for the full year.
Wow. Well, yeah, I want to get into that, the creative side, the business side, and all of those things. But I guess let's start with giving the audience some context. I want to get to your background in a second, but first let's talk about what is Hawkeye Music Publishing, and how did you come to found this new company? What was the genesis behind that idea?
Yeah, so prior to Hawkeye, I had another publishing company called Atlas, which I sold in 2019 to what's now called Hybe USA. I agreed to stay on with them for a couple of years to oversee the transition, which I did. And when I left, I realized, the marketplace for copyrights is just through the roof. So you have all these investor types funds like the Blackstones, the BlackRocks, the Carlyles of the world coming in trying to buy music copyrights. A lot of them make big headlines. They're big splashy.
And are you talking about like existing catalogs or?
Yeah, existing catalogs. So I have a lot of those connections. Like I had signed at one point Elvis Presley estate, Quincy Jones, Ashford Simpson, John Denver. So I was working with all these catalog folks, but with Hawkeye, my focus with Hawkeye is really on developing the next catalog. And I feel like in the publishing sector, there's a real void with so many people paying attention really only to transacting catalogs. A lot of attention is no longer being paid on the active songwriters. So the bigger companies tend to gobble up catalogs or buy other companies, and it leaves this void for like a hands-on sort of touchy-feely creative publisher that will actually work writers into rooms, which is, of course, a huge part of what a publisher does. So with Hawkeye, I made the decision I didn't want to post my own back office and deal with the overhead associated with royalties, licensing, legal, that kind of work. I just wanted to create a forward-facing creative brand that has a team of creatives that are out there signing writers, new writers, generally speaking, and working those writers into rooms, trying to get them cuts with artists, et cetera, et cetera. However, I also do have this big catalog side to who I personally am. So I made an arrangement with this bigger company, Roundhill, whereby when I come across catalogs through my relationships that might be looking to sell, I bring them over to Roundhill. So it's sort of the best of both worlds. Yeah, so it allows me to sort of flex the catalog muscle, but really focusing on the new creators, the newer writers, the ones that really need development. And this happens, by the way, every 5, 7 years in the industry. I'm sure it probably is similar in film where, you have these really great independent companies. Like my prior one was Atlas, and they get to a certain size, and a bigger company comes along and says, "Hey, we'd like to buy you." So like rather than recreate what you've done over these last 7 or 8 years, we just like to buy you. So what you end up is you end up with companies like Concord's a good example, BMG, Sony. They've purchased a lot of other companies and big catalogs, and they become very, very big, which is fine. It's a business unto itself, but it leaves a lot of room where you have a lot of creators who want more attention. Even some of the bigger writers, they just in that environment, in that system, they don't get the same level of attention that a more hands-on independent can do. And that's always where I've thrived. I've always enjoyed being on the independent side. Way back when I was at EMI on the recorded side, which was great. It was a great, it was actually my first sort of real job in the music industry, but I became aware very quickly that it was so big and so segmented. It felt just too corporate for who I am. And I felt like a lot of artists were sort of getting lost in that big system. Whereas the independents can focus, we sign less, but we work harder on what we sign. It's more important that what we sign is successful because we don't have the luxury of, you know, we don't sign 100 artists and hope 10 work. We sign 10 and hope that 10 work. So
Gotcha.
it's sort of a different model.
I'm curious about something because I just want to make sure I'm understanding, the business side of what you're talking about. You mentioned, did you say transactional catalog versus newer catalog? Is that the phrase you used?
Yeah, so
And
existing catalogs.
I'm curious what that means. What are the different types of catalogs and what distinguishes them is what I'm trying to get at.
Yeah, it's a good question. So for me, a legacy catalog is a catalog that's at least 5 years old, probably more like 10 plus years old.
And is that tied to a specific artist or a group of artists?
It can be both. Oftentimes it could be one artist, but oftentimes it's a company that has already collected a number of artists and is
I
looking to
got you.
sell itself. And it's, the reason why financial institutions came into this space the way they did is those revenue streams tend to be very predictable. So you have, 10, 20 years of history of revenue to look at. So okay, if I buy this at this price, I can expect at least to get these types of annual revenues for the next 10 years. The big upside for the catalog side of the business is digital. So the paradigm for how publishers get paid has shifted dramatically with the onset of on-demand streaming. So it used to be, you would buy a record, a tape, or a CD. You bought that once. I would get as a publisher 9.1 cents for the song that I might control on that CD. And then our business was done together. It was a purchase-based business. These days, every time you go on to say Spotify or Apple Music and listen to my song, I'm getting paid. It is a micro penny, but after a certain amount of streams, let's say it's 250, 300 streams, now every stream after that, I'm making more money than if you had bought the CD.
Oh, wow.
So it becomes this perpetual revenue opportunity. And, a lot of the big financial institutions recognize this. And so they kind of jumped in and they look at this as it's an important asset. It's also considered uncorrelated, meaning it doesn't necessarily go with the general market. So the Dow might go.
Yeah, what do you mean exactly?
So like the traditional, say, stock market
Ah,
might go down. Music assets tend to stay steady and rise. So they consider that an uncorrelated asset. So if you're putting together a full portfolio, if you're a fund manager, it's nice to have some of those in there to balance out other assets that might go this way while these go that way. So yeah, but that's really what drove folks in. That and also copyright protection has gotten a bit stronger really around the world, but in particular in the US. Without getting into all the details because they are pretty in the weeds, but we effectively got a 44% raise on sales revenue that we receive for owning copyrights. That's a big number.
yeah.
Uh, and so when you combine that with the new perpetual nature and all the different streaming services that, whether it's, just audio or whether it's Netflix and Prime, we earn money as copyright owners on all those platforms. and we'll talk about that too. So typically when you let's say take a film, for example, if I license one of my songs into a film, it's called the synchronization license. It's generally a it's
Excuse me.
generally a one-time fee that I get paid that one time. However, I'm also going to get performance money when that film airs on the various streaming services and across digital platforms. So the more streaming services you have, the more opportunity that film has to be streamed, the more potential revenue I make. So it's because of all those reasons, this paradigm shift, that you have a lot of money coming into the space. But it doesn't change the fact that you cannot only focus on catalogs. You have to focus on the next catalog. How do we build the next catalog, right? And that's going to be with today's writers across all different genres. But the reality is 20 years from now, someone will look back at something that was created today and say, oh yeah, that's a legendary song, right? It's the new sort of songbook. And that's just something I love to do. It's been a personal mission of mine, and it's just fun. It's a lot of fun, and done right, you could also make a lot of money doing it for everyone. It's also a little bit more rewarding when you are able to put a young new writer in a position where they're now making a living off of what they do because of some of the work you've done to help them kind of accelerate their career.
I'm curious, like we talked to a lot of film distributors and stuff about how today's technology, ever-changing landscape has changed the business in terms of like film streaming, like streaming websites. I'm curious on your end, you kind of touched on it, how, you know, people really, I mean, they still do, but records are still bought physically, but a lot more streamed, Spotify, iTunes, whatever, how that's maybe
Yeah.
changed the business model over the years. Just from a consumer, I feel like I see a lot more people releasing records or albums that have 20 songs, which maybe weren't as common back in the day. So I'm curious what your take is on the ever-changing platform.
Yeah, that is very interesting. It used to be, as a publisher, you kind of got a little spoiled because back in the days where everyone was buying records, you could have sort of what we would call a B cut on the album or an album cut, where it wasn't the single, so it wasn't getting the big radio play, but it was getting carried along because a lot of people were buying that full album. Whereas these days, it's certainly in the pop world, the hip hop world. That single is going to be streamed the most, but the album cuts, even if they put them on an album, are not going to get streamed nearly as much. So we don't make the same amount of money we used to on those album cuts, right? The album cut, the single is going to get 100 million, 150 million streams. Album cut might get 10 million. So it really is a dramatic difference. A lot of that also depends on genre. I still find, the singer-songwriter, certain country rock, they're still buying full records or still listening and streaming to more of the songs. Any artist that really has more of a loyal fan base, like the jam band scene, they're still, they're able to, get all their songs listened to versus, some of the pop stars. Now, Taylor Swift is the exception because every one of her songs is basically a single, but some of them, they may have one or two songs that work off an album, but no one else knows the rest of those songs.
I am curious too, like kind of staying in sort of the film slash music world, how we do a lot of independent work where people want to use today's modern songs. I'm curious, since maybe you're someone who people contact, how do filmmakers go about licensing music, reaching out to either the artist, the music label, whatnot, to see if uh they could use this popular song, and if there's kind of like this tier system where for a smaller budget movie you give maybe different prices to higher budget movies, stuff like that.
Yeah, I mean it's exactly that. So really if you're going to license the like an original version that's off of an album, there's really two sets of licenses. One is the master recording that comes from the record label or the master owner. And the second is the copyright, the publishing side, which you would go to a publisher for. Now, it can get a little complicated on the publishing side because more often than not, there's more than one writer. So you might be dealing with, for one song, you might be dealing with one record company and three publishers, and each of those licenses has to be gotten. Generally speaking, independent film companies, they tend to hire licensing companies in the middle because they don't really have necessarily the expertise to do all of that work. But it's pretty easy to figure out which companies own the rights, and then it's simply putting in a request for license. The way we always approach it is, first and foremost, our writers have rights of approval over synchronization. So first thing is, a descriptor of the scene, the creative side of it. Does our writer want their song associated with it? Assuming they do, the next step is budget. If it's a major Hollywood film, you're talking, it could be over $100,000, $150,000 just for the publishing side. Now, with independents, historically, what I've always done, assuming the creative boxes are checked, I did exactly what you're talking about, make step deals that are driven by box office, by sales. So I always feel like you want to give the independents the chance. So you can start with a low fee, maybe it's $500, $1,000. But as your box office grows and potentially as your film gets maybe picked up by a bigger distributor, then you can enhance those original sync fees. And it's called exactly what you said, step deals. And a lot of people, a lot of the bigger publishers maybe don't like that as much because, for them to do the work of cranking their licensing machine, they need a certain amount of money. Otherwise, it just doesn't make economic sense for them. For the independents, I think it's a little different. First of all, we're fellow independents, so we get it. We want to see these types of things succeed. But I always think back to some movies like a lot of people use the Blair Witch as an example that, it's such a small budget, but boy, if you had an opportunity to get a song in there, I don't think they really used any music, but if you did, you would have done well because of how well that film did. So in essence, you're sort of picking movies the same way you would kind of pick an artist. Like, do we think this has a real good chance of success? A lot of that can be like, all right, who's around it? Who's producing the film? All those types of sort of intangible things that go into it. But then I know also independents will use often library music. It's a little bit cheaper. Obviously, it doesn't have the same impact in a film that sort of a real song will have, but at least there'll be some sonic bed.
What if an artist, or rather a filmmaker, I mean, wanted to take, say, a pop song from the 70s or 80s or 90s and then maybe do a different version of it, take something that was real upbeat and maybe give it a dark version by re-recording it? Does that save them money? Is that something the original artist would be like, well, I don't really want to see a different take on that song? Does that happen?
It does happen. As a matter of fact, I've done that. I've been involved with a number of those. Whenever there's going to be a re-record done, it's always going to save the filmmaker money because you don't have to pay that other half. You don't have to pay the record company.
You're talking about the mechanical rights.
The synchronization.
The synchronization rights, okay.
Yeah. So if you use the original version, let's say you're going to go to Warner Music or Republic Records because they own that master. But if you do a different version, and a lot of times we call them visual vocals. It could be the actor singing on, it could be a completely different version. Like it sounded like you were getting towards like ethereal, spooky versions of known songs. There were a lot of TV shows actually that used to do that. I think Grey's Anatomy was one that was like kind of infamous for that. If the writer is the artist, they might have an issue with it and they can block it. But if the writer isn't that recording artist, then it's just up to the writer and the publisher.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, so that recording artist doesn't have a say on these remakes unless they were the writer as well, which isn't always the case.
And does it make sense? Let's say a filmmaker has an idea for a type of song they want.
Mm-hmm.
And it doesn't have to be a specific song. Maybe 10 different songs fill that, check that box.
Mm-hmm.
Is that something where they would deal with, someone like yourself or another licensing firm, and they would say, hey, this one's going to be too much. Maybe you should go for this one. Or does that even make sense? Is that
question? Yeah, no, that all the time. All the time we do that. I mean, I feel like most of the time we're tend to talk music supervisors from the film side into considering other options. Because I know, like, for example, I had Van Halen for many, many years.
Yeah,
Uh,
Melody was telling you got their song placed in some pretty good films. If am I correct
yeah,
about that? Or yeah, yeah,
yeah, I'll tell you the
yeah. I'd
Minion
love to hear
story
that.
was my favorite, but I just know that some of their A-level songs, there's a floor. They're not gonna license it for less than
Right.
super premium. So unless there's like another reason why, either someone's a friend of the band, or sometimes there are favors. I would steer them towards, hey, listen, there were also all these other songs on their records. Some of these have never been licensed, and I'm sure I can convince them to license this song versus that song at that rate. So that does happen a lot. It's kind of like almost like horse trading.
No, it
Like,
makes sense.
yeah, it does, and I think it does tend to work out sonically in the end. But the Minion story is my favorite because when we signed Van Halen over at Atlas, the promise, and I'm a huge Van Halen fan, by the way. I should just preempt this by saying like super fan. And I was so over the moon, like getting them, but it really came down to me, the discussion I had with Ed and Al, the brothers. They did all their publishing work directly, which was kind of cool. So we talked to them directly. Was listen, like, I love you. I know every song. I could play Jump on the keyboard, but at that time, like, my 10-year-old has no idea who you are. And that's a problem for the future of the catalog. The
Makes
way
sense.
the way you continue to add value to catalogs is you introduce it to newer generations, and you do it in cool ways. So they were totally bought in on that concept. So they moved their catalog from Warner Chappell, which had been there for probably 30 years. They moved it to us. And then I'll just tell you, in the year one, we doubled the sync money that they were making at Warner Chappell, because at Warner Chappell is a much bigger company. There wasn't that intent focus on Van Halen, whereas we only had one Van Halen. So we were putting in all the energy. But one of the earliest syncs was a Universal property called Minions, which was the spinoff of Despicable Me. And I'll never forget the conversation because, obviously it's kind of like a cartoony thing. And I brought my friend over there, Rachel Levy, who's at Universal, who does their music supervision, said, hey, I have this scene where Stuart, who's one of the Minions, is going to be bequeathed the guitar from the Queen, and he's going to rip into a solo. Do you have anything? And I said, I have like the greatest solo ever done. I have Eruption. I have Van Halen's Eruption. And she was like, "There's no way, we always have trouble licensing Van Halen because historically they did it like at the bigger companies." I said, "Rachel, I'm going to get this to happen." So I got on the horn with both Ed and Al, and I was explaining, like, and then the Minion picks up the guitar and plays Eruption, and they're like, "What the fuck is a Minion?" Right? Like, so I'm like, guys, I promise you, like, this is $1 billion franchise. Just trust me on this. This was actually our first license, our first film license we did with.
Wow.
So we got, and this was the first time Eruption had ever been licensed into a film. So it was a good fee. I can't tell you exactly what it was, but you can imagine it was a universal fee. And as part of the license, we got clip rights so that I could take that little clip and use it on the Van Halen socials if they wanted to.
Oh, wow.
So there's this awesome clip. It's easy to find, and the Minion rips into Eruption, and it came out amazing. And Van Halen did put it like on their YouTube channel, and all of a sudden something started happening, which was the amount of views in the first day surpassed all the views of their next biggest video, which was like something from the 80s of like David Lee Roth doing Jump. And next thing you know, they were like over 500,000. And within a couple of months, it was like through the roof. The Van Halen fans and the kids were finding it at Van Halen socials. And I never forget the call. Ed and Al both called, like, we fucking love Minions. It was great. So that was the beginning of a great relationship with those guys and that catalog. And we did we did a lot of those types of things for those guys. We did also like we consider it sort of the Mount Rushmore, the pinnacle of licensing is a Super Bowl ad. And we had Running with the Devil, one of their bigger songs, in an Acura ad, Super Bowl ad, which was huge. And that's when you start talking about seven-figure licensing fees. So it makes everyone happy. The song got a great look. The car got a great look. That's always the best when everything comes together and everyone's happy. So if it's a film, like the filmmaker's like, yeah, that worked, and the artist, the musician's like, that's perfect. It does so good for my song. Those are the best.
I'm curious too. Like I'm sure it's always happened that way. Like you're saying with older songs being used in newer media today. I know like Stranger Things has done that a lot with 80s songs, Kate Bush, The
Yeah.
Clash with Should I Stay or Should I Go? Is this something like that you've seen is picking up speed, like, older catalogs being reused in newer stuff?
Yeah.
Or is this like a newer thing that's happening, or has this always been going on? I'm curious.
I feel like it kind of it goes on depending on the medium. Like I know specifically, like, the ad medium works. They say, okay, who's our demographic? Like who's earning money? So like I would say maybe it was like 5 or 6 years ago, 80s music started becoming like all over the place in ads because they recognize like, okay, children of the 80s are now out there making money. They have disposable income. Let's use songs that they know. And so there's some very tasty, and Van Halen's a good example of that. Then I do think also like productions like Stranger Things, their audience are they might be younger, but they're also aiming for parents. And so like there's that coolness factor of like, oh wow, running up that hill, Kate Bush, like that's amazing. So the parent gets exposed, the kid likes the song, probably because the scene was so cool in part. And next thing you know, Kate Bush is going back on tour. Like that's one of my favorite Sync stories is the power that a show like that has by getting that placement. So I do think, and then what happens is, music supervisors, the folks that are kind of choosing the music, I think they see that and they think like, oh, I want to do one of those. Like I would like to be attached. So I do think it kind of is contagious, and that's a good thing.
Staying in I kind of have a two-parter. The first part you don't have an answer to, that's completely fine. But I'm curious if you've seen a film, since you have kind of like more of a well-known job where people probably can assume what your day-to-day looks like as a person who handles artists. If you've seen a movie that deals with it, like Begin Again, or like even like This Is 40, where Paul Rudd's character is a guy who owns a record label. If you've seen a movie like that that seemed very accurate to you, and also what it's like going day to day trying to find those up and coming artists.
Yeah, I mean, most of them are not exactly, they usually make it a little more glamorous than it necessarily is. Like one of my favorites was Get Him to the Greek. I felt like that was just hysterical. Like, but I mean, I'm trying to think if there was this. I feel like there might have been a series. It wasn't a movie that did a nice job of like depicting like what it's really like. I feel like Teddy Geiger might have been in it. I can't remember the name of it, but it was I feel like it might have been HBO, but I felt like that one was more on point. Yeah, it's hard. And I think in some ways it's a little easier these days because of socials and your ability to sort of track data online on how an artist is doing. But I also I fear getting too analytical. Like, this is art, so you don't want to just say, well, this girl's got, more views and more friends than this person. Like some of it's like, okay, well, what are you hearing, right? Like as an A&R, or on the publishing side, we call them creatives, but it's the same kind of thing. Now, it's interesting too, because there is a difference between what an A&R at a label has to do and what a publishing creative has to do.
And what is A&R again?
Artist and repertoire.
Oh, gotcha.
So these are the folks that go out and actually, basically sign up artists. And in their world, they're looking for, it doesn't always have to be the greatest songs because they could always get songs from other writers, but they need like sort of that X factor that, are they good looking? Like that, obviously the vocal qualities, like what are the qualities about presenting this artist versus me as a publisher? It's entirely about their songwriting. Like, how good of a songwriter is this person? And by the way, songwriting also includes producing to a certain extent these days, beats and stuff. And I could care less what they look like, how old they are. It's more about, can they deliver music that I can work with the A&R over here on getting cut?
Sure. So when you were talking about, finding the artist and basing it on songwriting and things like that, would that be, would it be fair to call that how you're building their brand, or is that the wrong term?
Um, the writers, it's more of a B2B brand. So like,
What does that mean, B2B?
so business to business, meaning the writers generally aren't front-facing consumers like, fans, as like the artists are.
So the
So
writers, you sign the writers who are creating the songs for the artists and for the catalog.
correct. Now,
Gotcha.
sometimes they're both. Sometimes they're both. Often, like, if I sign a band, they often are, it's often both. They do both. But I also sign a lot of pure writers that don't perform. They can perform, some of them can get up there with an acoustic and have a decent voice and they can present a song, but they're not going to sell records. So the most important things I look for in writers is, are they writing compelling music? So let's say it's an all-in, we call it an all-in writer, someone who's doing music and lyric. Are they writing compelling lyric for today? Are they writing compelling music for today? And can they, like, how are they in studio? So when I hook up a writer with an artist, it's like it's any date, right? It's like, what's the chemistry? So some are better than others, sometimes it's uncomfortable, when you don't know somebody and you're asked to go into a studio with them and create sort of a song baby together. It can be challenging. Some are better than others. Most eventually get it and come around. So, I've also had some folks who had such bravado and it's like a turn off. And so I have to help correct that and say, have that hard conversation, almost like a dad, like, hey, if you want to get work, you're going to have to kind of calm it down a little bit. And so most artists or most writers will listen. Some won't, but most will. Yeah, no, that's the fun of it. That's sort of the magic, is like, especially like taking concepts that might not be so obvious. Like I had signed, I had worked with John Legend when I was at Cherry Lane. So John Legend, before he was John Legend, was John Stevens. So he came to us as John Stevens, and I remember he sat in our conference room at the time and played Ordinary People, which was, before it was released, and we were all kind of like, whoa, that's pretty amazing. So he came and joined us, and I encouraged him to go to Nashville, and he was like, Nashville? What? I'm not like a Nashville guy, but he's such a good, prolific musician and writer that I knew he would do well down there, and he did. And he made friends with everybody. Like, he was working with John Rich, and he became kind of a guy that people would go to. So those to me are always a little bit more fun, because then you're sort of pushing genre boundaries too. Like, you don't want to. It's this constant push pull between release something that sounds like something that's been successful, but at the risk of just staying so boring. Like you go down that same chute too many times, and kids and ears, people, I think, naturally want to hear something different. It's like why, historically, when you saw, it was amazing, like when Nirvana came into the scene and kind of like wiped out heavy metal in like a day. It was kind of unbelievable. These shifts kind of happen, but it is fun to see these different collaborations go, that might, if you just step back and say, that probably won't work, but maybe it will.
Staying on like the collaboration and like music creation process, I'm curious. I've always wondered, especially when it comes to films, when artists make songs for films, like, whether it be the new James Bond movie coming out that needs, a popular artist attached to it,
Yeah.
is how I'm interested in how the behind the scenes works, whether it's like the filmmakers or, whatever film production company wants X artist, or are artists putting in bids to be in those types of movies or make songs for those types of movies?
I think it can be a little of both. I think sometimes if the movie's big enough, they might already have that idea in their mind. Like I'm pretty sure, like with Titanic, I'm pretty sure probably James Cameron was like, I hear Celine Dion singing this, like the biggest voice of that time period. But I've gotten calls for that where I've been, basically asked like, hey, we're looking for this type of song, this type of artist. You have recommendations? And so it can happen that way. It's interesting because the real behind the scenes of it is, well, who owns that song, right? So the film is paying for it, and film company generally is paying a fee. So in a lot of cases, they'll end up owning that copyright. So even if, when a writer writes for film, 9 out of 10 times it's called work for hire. So you paid me money, I wrote you a song, you own that song. I might still own my what's called writer share. So just backing up in publishing, there's really two halves to a copyright. There's the publishing half and the writer's half. The publishing half is kind of what transacts. The writer is always going to really maintain their 50% of royalties. So even if, like, if let's say Universal owns some of the songs that were done for Minions, the writers of those songs will still get a check. They just can't administer or license or control it. It's controlled by the film company. So with like, let's say when Justin Timberlake did Trolls, now there's a guy at that time particularly had a ton of leverage, one of the biggest artists in the world. I'm guessing he probably co-owns that copyright with the film studio. So it's always a negotiation. But yeah, it's fun. That's actually another fun part of the publishing side is when you are putting people together, you also then have to come up with the splits. So certain genres like country, if three artists go in a room, three writers come out, they own a third, a third, a third. Doesn't matter who contributed what. Pop and hip hop, you end up with someone has 4%, someone has 16%.
And why is that?
Well, I think the Nashville thing is more traditional. I think in the pop side, it's just more like, well, I did this and you only did that, and I've seen songs that have had 8, 9 writers on it with little micro pieces. Now that's a nightmare, it's particularly for film companies, because sometimes it's like, oh, I gave writing credit to my friend who was in the studio, and they don't even have a publisher. So it's like, well, how do I license that 2%? It becomes a big pain in the butt. It's I think these days maybe not as bad as like when I was doing the Black Eyed Peas. We had a lot of splits and a lot of disputes. And when there's a dispute is the worst, because that's when licensing freezes, because no one wants to take a chance, like a film company or TV show, an ad agency. Well, they're like, well, I need to license 100% of the copyright. I can't license 70% and hope the other 30 works itself out. So that song ends up suffering because the splits weren't lined up correctly. It's something I try to teach, especially newer writers, from day one. Sometimes it's awkward and you can always blame it on your publisher, but you want to walk out of every studio with a split sheet that's signed by everybody at that moment before it's a hit.
So I'm assuming this what you're talking about is referring to writers who maybe don't work together a lot, whereas, and correct me if I'm wrong, whereas like if the band were the writers, that kind of dispute could fuel animosity between the band members. So maybe they don't go that route, or am I wrong on
Yeah,
that?
it's a 50-50 with bands. Like, as an example, Van Halen split everything 25% equally amongst the four of them.
Right.
The Who doesn't do that. Like, so it depends, but I think it's pretty safe to say, as in the band dynamic, right away who's getting what writing credit, versus like what you pointed out, like if you put 3 or 4 strangers in a room, there could be it could get somewhat confrontational. And what tends to happen is nobody wants to have that awkward conversation. Like, after you've just had this sort of great session together, nobody wants to say, okay, listen, I need, we got to sign off on this. So they don't. And then all of a sudden you might have a hit. And now it's much harder to negotiate percents. All of a sudden everyone wrote a little bit more than than they actually did. So you end up with these fights.
Well, I'm curious about something because I mean, in my mind, I'm thinking a writer's going to come in who's, got the chops for a particular type of song. What is the scenario where you would be putting different writers together for a given song? I mean, are you saying you're teaming them up on a song that you've chosen? Just walk me through that. How you would have
Yeah.
different writers
So
working on the same
it
thing.
it would be more like a session. So it would be let's say, we've done this for Usher in the past, or someone's recording a record, and I have a producer who's who's great and maybe has had some cuts with Usher or similar artists before.
And do you have an existing song at this point that's
No, not necessarily.
okay?
Yeah.
Interesting.
So they walk into that room, and then there's Usher, then there might be what we call a top liner, someone who kind of does the melody. Then there's Usher himself, and maybe there's a lyricist, or maybe there's two
So
producers.
you're creating in the room.
In the room, it gets
Oh,
created.
interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Now there might be a sort of topical idea, and often these days, because of technology, you can send stuff back and forth before you actually necessarily get together. But I have seen it where, people will go into one room and they'll bang out a song, that started as nothing and ends up they a lot of times these are called writer camps. So we'll rent out a studio for a few days, and we'll have a multitude of writers from different publishing companies come in, and you'll have an artist kind of float through each room, and it's work with the idea that hopefully that artist walks out with a handful of songs.
So the genesis of that event is the team you're building, not necessarily a song idea you're starting with, or am I
Correct.
wrong?
It usually revolves around an artist. So
Interesting.
like we don't really necessarily want our songwriters writing in a vacuum. I mean, they can. I mean, they're going to write songs when they're going to write songs. I'd rather them expend energy writing for a project that potentially will get released, because that's the only way they make money.
Right,
That's the only way I
right.
make money. So it's important to balance out the, like, yeah, if you get up in the morning and you start writing and you keep ideas, that's great. But, more important is, when you have specific artists that are looking for songs. We also keep what's called a who's looking list, or a
What
casting
does
list.
that mean?
So we'll scour the record label community, and at any given time, we'll know what artists that are working on albums right now. So
Oh,
that
interesting.
and so like and the A&Rs will give us what we call a brief, like a quick brief. Up tempo, wants to talk about, his dog or whatever. There'll be some creative direction in it. Can you submit some songs? So sometimes it's a song submission where then we give the brief to our writers, they'll send the songs in, we send them to the record label, the artist might pick it, and the writer may never meet the artist, which is can be very interesting. I actually had that happen. There was a guy, sadly he's not with us anymore. DL Byron was his name, and he wrote Shadows of the Night, the big Pat Benatar song. So I
Yeah.
represented that song and I represented DL. And unbeknownst to me, I assumed that they did it in collaboration, or they at least had met. He had written that song for another artist that he was working with, but it might have been Clive Davis. Someone said, no, 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 I'm going to give this to Pat Benatar. She cut it. It became a big hit. So when I started working with DL, Pat Benatar was coming through the Capitol Theater, which is over here in Portchester, New York. So I said to him, "Hey, do you want to go? Like, I'm sure Pat would love to see you." He's like, "Oh my God, I never met her." I'm like, "Are you kidding me?" So because I knew her husband Spider and her a little bit. I was the guy who introduced them,
That is
and
so funny.
I have this amazing picture of them together. Like, he brought an album copy of the song and she signed it, and we got this awesome photo together. And he was crying. He was like, it was really kind of unbelievable moment. But so yeah, sometimes that happens where the artist just never meets the writer.
That is crazy. That's crazy. Well, Richard, this has been really fun. I've learned a lot. I didn't know a lot about this world of music and publishing, and so it's fascinating to talk to you about it.
Yeah.
If people want to follow what you're doing and your work and the stuff you're creating, is there like do you interface with the public on songs and publishing? And if so, where does that happen?
Yeah.
Is there like a website or?
The best way to get to me personally probably is either through my LinkedIn or my Instagram. unless obviously I have a phone number, but I wouldn't want to necessarily give that out. Yeah,
All
I'm
the
just
all the up and coming musicians and writers will be flooding your cell phone.
yeah. No, it's okay. I mean, I get hit up a lot on Instagram where I think the younger writers tend to be. Um, but one other thing I did want to say to point out, because I know a lot of
Sure.
your listeners are filmmakers. Another interesting thing about publishing is when you do create a film and create score music as a producer, you've hired a composer and that score is owned by you. Film companies should have their own publishers to look after that music, and oftentimes they don't, because they don't realize that that actually earns money. So like when that film is being played, it's earning those copyrights, those musical copyrights are earning royalties. And unless you have a publishing administrator, you're not collecting it. It goes into a black box, and in 5 years it gets distributed out.
Oh, wow.
And having represented DreamWorks, the film side, I can tell you that for great scores, like Gladiator was probably the best example of this. We repurposed the themes from Gladiator into trailers for other films because of
No
that sort of
kidding.
epic sense. And you're talking about $75,000, $100,000 a pop.
Sorry, I had no idea that happened. That's
Yeah,
interesting.
I think it was about 14 times we had in total. And it's subtle because, you're taking parts of, the theme or even like the war scenes, and you're using it for 30 seconds, but it emotes, it brings that emotion, which is what the trailer wants, even though the trailer could be for it is something completely different. But it's that big score music tends to work. So you can then help a film company turn what's normally a red line on their budget, right? The composer, into a black line because you're getting them licensing fees. And most film companies don't think about it. And I get it because they're thinking more importantly about
Right.
success of the film. But you do tend to own music assets. So you have to just make sure they're being cared for.
And is that something that a filmmaker, can he create that publishing arm on his own, or does he have to go to a third party person to do that?
Probably better off to go to a publisher and just do a deal, do either administration deal with a publisher so they can help with it. All the because it's the publisher that registers that music globally. So every society around the world knows, like, okay, XYZ film company owns this music. The publisher will do all the collections, take their fee, and then pay it through.
So the publisher is in a sense managing that, but the filmmaker still owns those rights.
Correct.
Oh, that's fascinating.
Yeah,
That's great advice.
Yeah, no, I wanted to make sure and bring that up because I know your audience some of them will appreciate that. Even big brands, like I had done deals with WW at the time F, which is now E. The amount of money they make because they own those theme songs when the wrestlers come out is incredible. It's unbelievable how much money is made by owning copyrights. Merv Griffin, the guy who owns all the casinos or owned, said he's made more money owning the Jeopardy theme than all of his casinos.
Oh, wow.
Because he produced Jeopardy. I mean, so it just
Yeah, and
gives
you hear that theme all the time.
all the time. And every time you hear it,
Oh,
just
wow.
ching, ching, it earns.
That's fascinating.
Yeah.
Well, Richard, that's great advice, and you've been a total delight to talk to. So, if you don't mind, I'd love to circle back sometime and we could talk more about all this.
Yeah,
It's fascinating.
100%. I would love it. And then next time I'm out in Austin, I'll be sure to look you up.
Definitely, if you come in for Austin Film Festival or South by, or just come to visit Melody, you let me know and we'll catch up.
I will. And Andrew, good luck with the car, man.
Thank you very much. We'll see what happens.
Yeah.
All right, well, take care.
All right. See you guys.
Thank you for listening to the Filmmaker Mixer podcast, a podcast created and hosted by filmmakers Jeff Stolen and Andrew Lamping, and produced by Melody Lopez.
Our theme song was composed by Stephen D. Bennett.
Make sure to follow or subscribe on whatever platform you're listening to us on, and stay tuned for future episodes.